Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Kafet. Today's daf is sponsored by David and Mitzi Geffen in loving memory of David's grandmother, Sarah Henna Rabinowitz Geffen, on her 65th yahrzeit. She and her husband, Rav Tuvia Geffen, rabbi of Sherif Israel Synagogue, brought up their 8 children with love and learning. 7 of the grandchildren made Aliyah, and many great-grandchildren live in Israel. Okay, we're going to get started with a quick review of yesterday's daf. So we saw this Mishna in Shekalim, which said that the Beit Din had made a stipulation that the kohanim were allowed to use the salt of the temple and the wood of the temple. The wood we actually ignored for right now. We're going to come back to that somewhat at the beginning of today's daf. But first we're going to talk about the salt. We started yesterday. Shmuel said, oh wait, it's not that they could use the salt for anything they wanted, but he limited it to their korbanot and not to their eating. Then we had a whole question. What did he mean when he said korbanot and not eating? Korbanot what? Eating what? So the first explanation was korbanot meant to salt the korbanot, and eating meant to eat the meat of the korbanot. So they can use it for salting on the mizbeach, but they can't use it for eating. Now the Gemara said that's a problem because we know, number one, that they can eat they can use the salt of the temple. That's what they did in the salt chamber. If you didn't know, there was a salt chamber in the temple. In the salt chamber, they would actually salt the hides to protect them from spoiling. So if that's the case, of course they could use it. If they could use it on the hide, they could use it on their meat. And then they said there's another issue, which is what created basically, was the proof text of the second version, is it makes no sense to say that the kohanim could salt the korbanot, use it for salting, for burning on the altar, when the Israelim could obviously use it. And we showed how we know the Israelim were allowed to use salt from the temple, and they had that whole drasha, right? Could go this way, could go that way. In the end, there's words in the pasuk that teach you the salt for all the Israelites' korbanot comes from the temple, so obviously the kohanims do. And that's what led us to option 2, which was to say, actually to salt the meat, you could use the salt for eating. What you can't do is the chulin. What kind of chulin? Well, the chulin that would be added, that you would eat them so that you could eat your mincha ala sova. Well, right, so you could be satiated when you finish eating your mincha, as is appropriate for sacrificial items to eat them in a satiated manner. So you would think maybe that those foods you could salt from the temple because it's connected to eating sacrificial items, but no, you can't. However, at the end of the Gemara, and we're going to start there again in today's daf, which is, we bring in this Mishna, and what we're going to say is basically Rav Mordechai says to Rav Ashi, the Rav Shisha, Bereid, Rav Edi said that this Mishna was needed specifically for Ben Buchri's opinion. Now, we didn't get to explain that yet, but let's just go back and review Ben Buchri and Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai's debate. So, it's a fascinating debate, really. Rabbi Yehuda says that Ben Buchri testified in Yavne that any Kohen who wants to can bring the machatzit hashekel, and they're not going to be called a sinner. It's a bit of a strange statement. We're going to come back to this soon. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai said, what do you mean? The kohanim have to bring the machatzit hashekel. And then he said that there's kohanim that by mistake think that they don't need to bring it. And what did they darshan? This is where we ended yesterday. They say that since the mincha of the kohen is supposed to be completely burned, and since the Torah stipulates that there's a mincha omer, there's a shtei alechem, there's lechem apanim, that are supposed to be eaten, basically the Torah is telling us that the kohanim don't have to bring machatzit hashekel. Because if the kohanim bring machatzit hashekel and they pay into the machatzit hashekel fund, then these korbanot become their own. And if they become their own, then they have to be completely burned. But the Torah says they don't get completely burned, they get eaten. So come the kohanim and they say, we obviously are not obligated to bring the machatzit hashekel, and we can't bring the machatzit hashekel, because if we do, we're going to ruin, right, and we're going to go against what the Torah says. The Torah says these aren't burnt, and they're going to become ours, and they're going to be burnt. Now the Gemara in Shekalim gives a reason what the issue, how to resolve this, and basically says, well, the kohanim actually can give machatzit hashekel and give it so that it's no longer theirs, and they say, okay, we're giving this to the temple, it doesn't belong to us anymore. And then those korbanot don't belong to them. And this leads to like a whole question. Gefet of yesterday went up in Hebrew of Rabbi Elazar. Hopefully the English will go up soon. It's always a little bit delayed, or not always, but sometimes a little bit delayed. So, but the topic is, I'll read you the topic in Hebrew. Tzibor, is it an osef yechidim or yeshut chadasha? Fascinating question, has lots of ramifications. In general, in a machshava perspective, is the tzibor a grouping of individual, like a bunch? It's like the whole is made up of the sum of its parts, or is it a separate, complete, different entity? Okay, and that's really what's going on here, right? The kohanim said, "Oh, it's just right. It's a all the parts add up to a whole." Now, still, you could say, right? One option is to say, well, majority rules, and in the end, right? If you look at it as a tzibur, as the sum of its parts, still the kohanim were wrong, because you could say, well, the majority of the people are Israelites, so in the end, it's owned by the majority, and it's not really owned by the kohanim, and that's why it's not burned. Or you could say that once it becomes communal, it becomes a completely different entity. And it's not, right? So you give your money to the community, it's not like it's your money anymore. This is like if you give to a charity, do you have a right to determine what they do with the money, right? Are you an owner, part owner of what goes on there? It's a very interesting topic. So you could go with it lots of places. But basically, what we have here is two opinions. Ben Buchri says the kohanim don't even have to give. If they want to, they can. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, which actually is super interesting, but really not what we're talking about today, but because his opinion is not what's relevant here, but he says the kohanim have to give the machatzit shekel, and those who claim they don't are completely wrong. Okay? Now, the Gemara is going to ask a question according to Ben Buchri. Le Ben Buchri, kevan de lechatchila lo mechayev la'atuye, ki maitinami chotehu tekama ayel chulin la'azara. He says, wait a minute. According to Ben Buchri, we're going to have a question before we even get to what this is doing here. According to Ben Buchri, if they're not obligated to bring the machatzit shekel, then how could they possibly bring the machatzit shekel? Because when they bring it, they're doing something incorrect. What are they doing? They're bringing chulin into the azara, because you're not allowed to bring chulin items. Now, if you're obligated to the machatzit shekel, by the way, you can have especially if you listen to the Gefet Shir, but in general, there's a lot to say here about the machatzit shekel, right? When we're getting up to Parshat Shekalim soon, it will relate, and you can have good Divrei Torah for the table. But when you give the machatzit shekel, according to Ben Buchri, if you're not obligated, then you're actually sinning. Because, right, and he says you're not a sinner, and he seems to be relating to this. Because if I bring something I'm not supposed to bring, it doesn't become sanctified. And then I'm bringing something sacred into the Azarah, something I'm not, what's sacred into the Azarah? I'm not supposed to bring a korban chatat, and I bring one or something, right? Or I bring an animal I'm not supposed to bring to the temple, right? That's not meant for sacrifice. Can't do that. So that's basically what the kohanim are doing here. To which they answer, Demaite umar masar lahon letzibur. Okay, they come and they bring it, according to Ben Buchri, and they give it to the community. And the chiddush here is, when he says they're not sinning, what he's saying is, we're not worried that they didn't give it wholeheartedly, and they don't really want to part with their money, and they still feel connected to it. No, they give it, and they say, this is now going to be communal funds. Even though we're not obligated, it now becomes communal funds. Okay? Fine. What does this have to do with our topic? Well, what was our whole question, or one of the main questions we were left with at the end, is if you try to say that the kohanim are allowed to use the salt of the temple for their korbanot to burn on the altar, right? We said there's no reason to explain it that way, that the court would have to stipulate that. If all the Israelites use the salt, obviously the kohanim could use salt. But now you can start to see the reason why. According to Ben Buchri, Sal kadat hachamina, you might have thought, ki zake lehu rachmana liYisrael di lehu lishka, but the kohanim delay lehu lishka lo zake lerachmana. When the Torah said you can use the salt from the temple now the Torah never said it, but we darshan, right, that salt doesn't have to come from your home, right? That whole drasha we had. We said brit melech olam hu bnei Israel brit olam. We learned from the lechem apanim, since that's taken from communal, also the salt is communal. Well, that's only to people who pay in. Right? Here's the good drasha about the machatzit shekel. And not to people who don't pay in. Right? The kohanim, if they don't have to pay, according to Ben Buchri, now obviously according to Rabbi Elazar ben Zakkai, they have to pay, and therefore obviously they're part of this. But according to Ben Buchri, they don't have to pay. Well, if you don't pay in, do you get to benefit? Do you get the benefits? That's an interesting question, right? So if there's something communal and you don't give to the fund, are you allowed to benefit from communal things? So here they say, you might have thought that the kohanim don't get to use the salt from the temple because they didn't pay in. So how could they take money from the fund If you pay in, you get money. If you don't pay in, you don't get anything. Kamash malan, that's what the Beit Din was coming to say. No. Even though the kohanim don't have to pay, and they're not part of what's the lishka. If you remember, shalosh pamim b'shana tormim et halishka, that's what we call the trumat halishka, that's what we call the shekalim. Okay, the machatzit hashekel is given to the trumat halishka, and then from that money they take, tormim et halishka means they take the money and they buy the salt, the animals for the korbanot, all the communal items. Since they didn't pay in, you might have thought, but no, they get to benefit anyway, and that's why the court had to stipulate it, and that's why it wasn't obvious. And this goes back and reinstates the first option. So we're left with two possibilities, because this is only what Rav Mordechai says before we explained it the other way, but perhaps you could still explain it that the salting, yes, they can salt for the mizbeach, they can use the communal salt, even though you might have thought it was clear before, right, from the treasury, thank you, that's a good word, and you cannot use from the temple treasury for salting your own korbanot, your own personal korbanot. Now, this doesn't relate, by the way, to if they could use it for the hides, how come they can't use it for eating? We don't go back to that question, which is a good question, why? Okay, that ends that section, but there's one thing we didn't deal with yet, and that we're going to do until we get to the next Mishnah, which is, the Mishnah had also said about the wood that the kohanim also get to benefit from the wood. So now they say, Eitim zepshita le'letana de mishel tzibur minalan. The fact that the Tana here in that Mishnah in Shekalim, it was obvious to them that it belongs to that the wood is from communal needs. Where do we get that from? Minalan. What's the source? Ditanya. Yachol haomer harei alai ola yavi eitzim mitoch beito kederech shemivi nesachim mitoch beito. You might have thought, if I say I'm going to bring a voluntary offering, maybe you have to bring your own wood. Okay, just like you have to bring your own libations, but you don't take stuff from the temple for the libations. So maybe you have to bring your own wood to burn on the altar. Talmud Lamal ala itzim asher ala esh asher ala mizbech. So this is in the very beginning of Vayikra, first chapter, verse 8. It says the Bnei Aaron set up. This is the korban ola. They set up the body parts on the altar of the animal, and then it says on the wood, which is on the fire, which is on the altar. I don't need the words, it's superfluous to say on the altar. We know that on the fire is obviously on the altar. Where else is there a fire? So what are they darshan from this? Ma mizbeach mishel tzibur. Just like the mizbeach is made from communal property, okay, or belongs to the tzibur, af eitzim ve'esh mishel tzibur. So also the wood and the fire come from, which is really one and the same, right? The wood which makes the fire comes from communal property. Divrei Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. Okay, that's Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shimon. That's how we darshan the pasuk, which comes to teach us our halacha that you don't have to bring it from your own home. Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua Omer, he's going to darshan it a little differently, but Gemara is going to think at this point it's kind of one and the same. Ma mizbeach shelo nishtamesh bo hedyot. We're going to learn it from mizbeach, but what are we going to learn from the altar? An altar, it has to be made from stones that were taken from ground no one's ever used before, meaning that you can't take it from stones that were used. So, lo nishtamesh bo hedyot, that no one's used them before. Af eitzim va'esh shelo nishtamesh behen hedyot. They also have to be taken, the wood and the fire, from something from wood that's never been used before. Now, the assumption is, if wood's never been used before, well, it means you're not taking it from your house, because if it was from your house, it was probably used. So this seems to be saying one and the same thing, to which the Gemara says, my benaya, what's the nafkamina? What's the practical difference between these two opinions? The Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua had to say some other explanation. What's the nafkamina? Do they have to be new? There's one thing to say, you don't have to take it from your house, you take it from communal property. But communal property could have been used for something also. So according to Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, it has to be not only communal property, but it has to be communal property that was never used before for anything else. So now the Gemara asks this question, and this came up also in Zvachim, at the end of Zvachim, va'atike lo. Wait, old things that were used you can't use, v'haktiv, v'yomer arvana el David, yikach v'ya'al adoni hamelech hatov be'enav, re'eh bakar le'olav ha'morigim v'klei bakar le'etzim. Arvana gives David to do sacrifices. He gives him the bakar. This is he wants to build the Beit HaMikdash. So he says, here, I'm giving you bakar, cattle for korbanot olah, and the morigim and the klei bakar, and we're going to talk about these are threshing implements for the wood. So now, if he's taking it from this threshing equipment, it must have been used. So how can you say that you can use things that for wood in the temple that were never used? Here he's giving him used items. So they say, just like we saw this sugya at the end of Zvachim, it was in Kuftet Zayin Amud. So they say, Hachanami bechadeteno, what he gave him were new, they were brand new equipment that was never used. Okay, that's the way you have to explain it, otherwise it really makes no sense according to what we know halachically. Now we just have as an aside, which again we had in Zvachim as well, my morigim. What are these morigim? What's the word? What does it mean? Amar ula mitashel tarbal. Okay, it's a bed of tarbal, which doesn't really help us. Obviously helps someone at some point. They knew what it was. So now the Gemara, obviously a later edition, says, a later generation, they ask, my mitashel tarbal, can you explain to us this phrase? Okay, which according to the Koren, Steinsaltz, it gives the etymology. It comes from the Greek, okay, which is really a threshing board, which we're going to describe it right now what it is. Amar Rav Yehuda, Iza de korkasa. Okay, this korkasa, by the way, means circle. Okay, kurkas, like circle. In Greek also comes from circle. And they used often in threshing equipment these wheels that would also go around. Because what's the idea of threshing? You pound hard, right, with this, either with this board or with wheels that go over the wheat, the stalks, and then it separates the wheat from the chaff. So now they say it's iza de korkasa didashu badishtai. Okay, this is what they would use for threshing, and again, it was these. We're going to see in a second when we get it from the pasuk, but it was serrated. It had these things coming out, they're like teeth-like things coming out, and you would basically run it along the floor, and because of the serrated edges or pieces, or just teeth kind of thing that were coming out, that would pound on the grains and separate everything, and you would end up with a pile of grains separated from the chaff, right? And then you have to do the winnowing, which kind of moves, the wind blows all the chaff away, but the beginning part is to separate them. So Amar Rav Yosef, my crowd, where do we have a pasuk about this? Okay, I'm going to make you, the Jewish people, like a molag, which is this implement, the morigim, like a threshing board, that basically is going to be brand new with these teeth coming out, bal pifiyot, teeth jutting out, tadush harim, and you're basically going to thresh mountains. Okay, it's the strength. Okay, that's our sugya. So what we did in that section, before we start the next Mishna, see today's stuff is pretty short, we dealt with this Mishna from Shekalim. We reinstated the first interpretation of what it means, what Shmuel said about this Mishnah, that when they permitted the salt to be used from public funds, what they meant is used for their, and Shmuel said for their korbanot, but not for eating. What did it mean korbanot? What did it mean eating? Even though we kind of, in the end of yesterday's stuff, thought that it was the other direction, that eating meant actually eating chulin, and korbanot meant actually eating your sacrificial meat. You could use the salt for that. We now say, no. This was actually brought, according to Ben Buchri, that said you can even salt your meat. You can salt the meat for the korban, for the sacrifices, from the communal funds, even though you might have thought not, because the kohanim don't give to this truma, to the machatzit hashekel. Again, this is only according to Ben Buchri, and it basically is saying the Mishnah was written according to this interpretation of Rav Mordechai. It was written for Ben Buchri's opinion. If they don't give money, they still get to benefit like everybody else. That was the chiddush. And then we explained the eitzim. Where do we get it that the wood, the kohanim can use the communal funds? And this is basically derived from what everybody can use the wood from the communal funds. They don't go into this, trying to understand it. It just seemed like what's the chiddush here? Isn't it obvious? Okay, like they did in the previous. Here they just explain what the source is, and from that we got off a little bit about this morigim and what they are. Okay, now we go to the next Mishnah. Starting to talk again about ta'arovot. Things get mixed together. We're going to get to dinei bitul. Okay, things nullifying each other. Nit'arev kumtza bekometz chaverta. So after you take the kometz, and now you have the kometz, remember, in a kli sharet, in a sanctified vessel, and you're supposed to burn it on the altar, but before that happens, somehow your kometz gets mixed with another kometz. So, or, that's option one. So two kometzes get mixed up together. B'minchat kohanim, b'minchat kohen mashiach, b'minchat nesachim, or your kometz gets mixed up with a mincha of either a kohen, the kohen gadol, or the mincha that goes with all the libations of the sacrifices. What's unique about those 3 menachot? They all get completely burned. So now you have a kometz, which is supposed to be completely burned, and you have libations, mincha of libations or mincha of kohanim, which is also supposed to be completely burned. Now, one is the whole dough, and one is a kometz of it. So obviously one is bigger than the other. We'll get soon to lots of nullification. But you're allowed to basically, since this gets burned and that gets burned, you can bring it all to the altar. Okay, sounds pretty simple, because everything's going to be burned, so everything can go. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, listen, kometz and kometz, no problem. You can bring them and burn them both together, even though they got mixed up together. But if it's b'minchat kohen Mashiach, b'minchat nesachim, psula, shezo blilata ava, v'zo blilata raka, v'hem bolot zo mizo. He says, and now you have to understand how much flour and oil went into each of these sacrifices. Now, in the kometz, so first you make a dough and then you take a little bit out of that dough, but the dough itself is made with 2 kilos of solet with 1 log of oil. Okay, so 1 isaron, let's put it in the terms, 1 isaron with 1 log. 1 isaron is about 2 kilo, and 1 log is about, again, there's different opinions always, Chazon Ish always has bigger shiurim, but it's about 350 milliliters. Okay, so you can imagine, right, what that is. It's about 1.5 cups of oil with 2 kilo of dough. Not a lot of oil, okay, to dough, and that's what's called blilata ava. It's a thick dough because it doesn't have a lot of liquid. But when you go to the minchat nesachim, minchat kohanim, and all those, they have 3 log, so 3 times the amount, so 4.5 cups of oil to the same isaron, the same 2 kilo of flour. So that means that there's going to be a ton more oil in the others. Now, even though some of them are actually baked already, but still they're very oily. You know, when you have, latkes, let's say, right? The oil's coming out of them. So what's going to happen? They're going to absorb one from the other. Really, what are we concerned with? Well, the kometz, which doesn't have a lot of oil, is going to absorb oil from the other one, because the other one's very oily. And then what's the problem? Okay, now here there's about at least 3 opinions that I saw. So we're going to go with Rashi on this, but it's a little bit, you'll see, there's a certain point, we get to a point where it's a little complicated to follow because each of these interpretations have weaknesses to them. But what Rashi basically explains is that what's going to happen, when one absorbs from the other, you're going to end up with a situation that the kometz now has too much oil. And if you remember, if you have too much oil, it's disqualified. And the other one, the mincha with a lot of oil, is now going to have too little oil because it doesn't have as much oil as it's supposed to have. And that's going to be the problem. Okay? Now, we're going to get into laws of nullification. And here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Okay? Where do laws of nullification fit in? Okay? That's going to be a little bit of a weak point here. That's going to be a little bit of a challenge to explain and figure out exactly how this works. Right now, it doesn't necessarily seem like it has to do with nullification, although we're going to see that it really does, and we'll explain that as we get there. So now we're going to go off on a tangent. Okay, not really a tangent, but we're going to go into a completely different sugya, and only at the very end are we going to relate this to our Mishnah. So let's leave our Mishnah and come back to it later. Tnan Hatam is the Mishnah in Zvachim, okay, in Ayin Zayin, 77. Dam shenitarev b'mayim. What if you have blood that got mixed up with water and you want to put that blood on the altar? What do? Well, is it nullified or not? So now we're clearly in laws of nullification. Is the blood nullified into the water? It depends. Im yesh bo marit dam kasher. If it still looks like blood and the water hasn't diluted the blood so much that it doesn't look like blood, still looks like blood, you can use it, put it on the altar. Nitarev b'yayim. What if it gets mixed with wine, presumably red wine, and you can't tell the difference in the color? Ro'ino to ki'ilu humayim. So you figure out how much wine got mixed in. If it were water, right, you do an experiment. You take that exact amount of water, mix it with blood. Would the water have diluted that you wouldn't see it would look like blood? If so, problem, you can't use it. If it still would look like blood with that amount of water, the same amount of wine that fell into the blood, then you can still use it. Okay, those two are not relevant for our purposes. But here comes the third one. Nitarev b'dam behema b'dam chaya. What if it gets mixed with blood of an animal, meaning a chulin animal, right? And this is supposed to go on the altar, and this is a regular animal's blood got mixed in, or b'dam chaya, or the blood of an animal that can't even ever go on the altar, okay? Because chayot aren't brought on the altar, undomesticated animals. Okay, same thing. We view the blood as if it's water. If it would have diluted it, you wouldn't look like blood. No, if yes, yes. Okay. Now, Rabbi Yehuda. So basically, okay, same thing. Rabbi Yehuda omel, ein dam mevatel dam. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't disagree about the first two, but he says blood doesn't nullify blood. Why is this? This is classic Rabbi Yehuda, what we call min bimino eino batel. Two items of the same item don't nullify each other. What's his theory? Okay, in a minute we'll see where he gets it from the Torah. But his theory is, the way people explain Rabbi Yehuda, is that two of the same items have the same taste, the same everything. So how does nullification work? One overpowers the other. But if they're both the same, they don't overpower each other. It's the same taste, the same look, the same everything. There's no laws of nullification. I'm a Rabbi Yochanan now. So this is basically machloket here. Can blood nullify blood? And min bimino eino batel, right? Can it or can it not? Okay, that's the debate. Min bimino, is it batel or not? So, right, two of the same items, do they nullify each other or not? So Rabbi Yehuda says they don't. The rabbis say they do. And we're going to say that both learn it from the same pasuk. That's what Rabbi Yochanan comes and says. Rabbi Yochanan u'shnei mikra achad vershu. They both darshan in the same pasuk, but came to opposite conclusions. V'lakach midam hapar u'midam ha'se'il. Go back to this. We've talked about this a lot. The Kohen takes the blood of the bull and the blood of the goat, and he mixes them together. Now, when you mix the blood of the goat and the blood of the bull, right, he mixes them together, and then he puts them on the altar. Remember, we had a debate, the 43 or the 47, when he mixes them, before he does the 4, after he does the 4. Either which way, he mixes them at some point and puts them on the altar. Either he does 11 with them together, or he does only 7 with them together. The sprinklings on the inner altar. Now, everybody knows there's going to be a lot more blood of the bull, which is a much bigger animal, than the blood of the goat. So, if so, they should have nullified each other, right? What's clear here is they didn't nullify each other. The question is going to be why. For what reason did they not nullify each other? Because what really happens is when the Kohen, and he mixes them, and then it says he takes the blood of the bull and the blood of the goat, which are already mixed. Now, if they're already mixed, then they shouldn't be called the blood of the bull and the blood of the goat if nullification would work, because it just be called the blood of the bull, because it's way more than the blood of the goat. So the fact that it still calls it after they're mixed, the blood of the goat and the blood of the bull, shows that they don't nullify each other. So according to the rabbis, though, who think that dam is mevatel dam, right? So he says, what does he learn here? What's the reason why they're not nullified here? Because they're both going on the altar. And since they're both supposed to go on the altar, they both have significance, and things that he basically creates this principle, things that go on the altar do not nullify each other. Okay? That's his theory. And then that would apply only to things that go on the altar. But it wouldn't apply, going back to our case, to the blood of the animal that's not going on the altar, mixing with the blood of the animal that's going on the altar. Right? He would say, oh yeah, nullification works. So the blood could nullify, and that's why they say, if the blood looked like, if it was the amount of water, it would nullify it. Okay? So that's the rabbi's position. So again, we're at the top of Amabet now. Rabbi Yehuda saval, mikan lemin b'mino she'eino batel. Rabbi Yehuda says, what are you talking about? It's blood and blood, same type of item. Blood doesn't nullify blood. Okay? And likewise, any other item that's similar wouldn't nullify the other. And that takes it out of the world of korbanot, and it's just in the regular world. So now we're going to have a question on both of them. And we're going to have the same type question. It's what we call a mirrored sugya. We're going to have a similar type of question that we're going to ask the rabbis, similar to Rabbi Yehuda, but it's going to be flipped each time because each one holds a different opinion. You'll see in a minute what I mean. So first we ask, again, we're still not connecting this to our sugya, only at the very bottom of our daf are we going to connect it. Rabbanan savre, mikan le'olim she'em mevatlim ze'etzeh. So the rabbi, we're just quoting it, right? So the rabbis say, here we get, from this case, we get that things that go on the altar aren't mevatel ze'etzeh. V'dilma mishum demim b'minohu. We're basically going to ask each one. But Rabbi, as you said, it's olim, but they're also min b'mino. In other words, you can't ignore that, right? So maybe the Torah, maybe you're wrong in what you derive from it. Maybe the Torah is saying it's two similar items, blood and blood. You're kind of ignoring that fact. So he says, listen, if the Torah, and if the Torah wanted to teach us min b'mino, v'lo ashmi'inan olin, if they wanted to teach us the issue of two similar type items, And they didn't want to teach us this issue of olin ala mizbeach, things that go on the altar. If the Torah had taught us, I didn't say it right. Yesh me'ina means if the Torah had taught us this principle in a case that was two similar items, but they weren't things that went on the altar, and so they happened to choose a case where there are two things that go on the altar. So the rabbis say that's not coincidental. The reason the Torah chose things that go on the altar proves to you, right, if it had chosen a case, let's read it now in the words. Yashmina min b'mino, if it had chosen a case of, let's say, blood of a regular animal mixing with blood of a sacrificial animal, and it wasn't talking about sacrificial items, then kidduka marta, then I would agree with you. Hashtadash an olin mishum de olin. But here the Torah specifically said it in a case of things that go on the altar to teach you that it's only things that go on the altar. To which they ask him the obvious question. Well, you're ignoring the fact that it's also min b'mino. It's also two similar items. So dilma adiika min b'mino ve'olin. Maybe it needs both. Okay, maybe it needs to be. Now, when we say olin, what do we mean? We mean, let's say, so besides the fact that blood that's of a regular animal that's mixed with a sacrificial animal is going to be nullified, it also means that if you have, let's say, blood and it gets mixed with a kometz, and we say laws of bitul don't apply here, then one's not going to nullify the other, even though they're two completely different items, right? So that's also what the rabbis are saying. But maybe they're saying maybe you shouldn't say that. Maybe you should say it's only when it has all the criteria of the case in the Torah, both min b'mino, two of the same type, and things that go on the altar. And which the Gemara says kasha. This is in fact difficult to the rabbi's position. And then we do the exact same thing to Rabbi Yehuda, but from the other direction. Rabbi Yehuda savar mikam min b'mino she'eno batel. Right? Rabbi Yehuda holds. Here you see that two similar items don't nullify each other. V'dilma mishum de'olinhu. Maybe it should be because they go on the altar, and that's why. And it wouldn't apply to our case of blood of an animal that's not going on the altar and blood of a regular animal or any kind of, right? We take this completely out of the world of sacrifices in general, according to Rabbi Yehuda. He thinks any min b'mino isn't nullified. So, yesh min an olim min b'she'eno mino kidka marta. So now we're going to have his position. He's going to say, well, if the Torah had given us a case of things that go on the altar that were not the same item, then I would have agreed with you. But hashtadashmina min b'mino, but the fact that the Torah specifically talked about blood and blood, mishum de min b'mino, it's because it's min b'mino, and right, that must be the biggest issue here. To which the Gemara says maybe it's both, right? Dilma adika min b'mino ve'olin. Maybe it would have to be both blood and blood, same type of item, and it should also be things that go on the altar. Kashya. That's in fact difficult to Rabbi Yehuda. So they each have a difficulty because theoretically, if we're really learning this from the pasuk, you should really learn both. Okay, that's in the what the Gemara is saying, but it doesn't mean they're knocked out. Their opinions, their opinions exist, even though they're difficult. Now we get back to our issue. What does our issue have to do with bitul? So now they say Tanan. What Rabbi Yehuda says in the Mishna in Zvachim contradicts what Rabbi Yehuda says in the Mishna here. Let's see. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, b'mincha kohen Mashiach u'b'mincha nesachim psula, shezo b'lilita ava v'zo b'lilata raka. Right? This one is thick because it doesn't have a lot of oil. That's the kometz. And the mincha, right, the one that's the whole mincha here, is thinner, oilier, because it has a lot of oil. V'hem bol od zomizo. So now we're going to say they absorb one from the other. Now, what does this have to do with bitul? Well, the Gemara says, "V'chibol otzu mizo ma'have min b'minohu." Who cares if they absorb one from the other? They're min b'mino. Okay. Now, even they happen to also be olin on the mizbeach, but that's not the question because really only Rabbi Yehuda's position bothers us because it's Rabbi Yehuda and the Mishna who says this. The rabbis are fine because the rabbis say that. Now, what does it have to do? So here's the tricky part. Here's where it's not 100% clear cut, but if they absorb one from the other, okay, right? That's what we said. You have to remember how the world of bitul works. It's not the world of reality. It's a world of halachic reality. So in reality, what's going to happen, like we talked about the latkes, the oil drips out of the very oily thing and it's going to get onto something else, right? So we have a kometz, not a lot of oil. We have a mincha with a lot of oil. The mincha from there is going to get absorbed. And that's in the real world, okay? And therefore, now the way they're going to view this is, in a sense, what's going to happen is there's bitul going on because the oil that comes out, the small amount of oil that comes out of the oily one, goes into and kind of gets absorbed and nullified into the other one. Okay, here's where nullification works. So the kometz basically nullifies, okay, the oil and absorbs it into it, and it becomes absorbed. This is where it's a little tricky because it's not exactly the way laws of nullification always work. But basically, if we say there's no laws of bitul, then it shouldn't really matter what happens in reality. It's what happens in halachic reality. And if these two are the same type, oil, then the oil shouldn't be nullified into the other one. Okay, that's basically what we're saying. Now, it's weird to say laws of nullification because the oil is actually less in the kometz than the other, and it's really nullifying the other. This is where it starts to get a little murky waters here of how to understand this. I'm going to continue a little bit more because we have a shorter daf, and I'll just finish we'll finish this sugya. We have 3 more lines on Kaf Gimel Lamed Aleph. So basically what they're going to say is oil shouldn't nullify oil, and therefore the oil of one shouldn't really become kind of nullified and absorbed into the other because min b'mino eino batel, which basically means each one retains what it was originally. They're not considered nullified. This is considered with all its oil, and that's considered with all its oil, and therefore there shouldn't be an issue. So Amar Rava, and this we learned also, Kasava Rabbi Yehuda, he holds, Koshu min b'mino v'davar acher. This isn't classic min b'mino, because it's not just oil and oil. There's oil and oil. There's also solet. There's also the flour. So it's called a min b'mino and something else. Okay? Now, whenever you have a min b'mino and something else, salek et mino, how do laws of nullification kick in now? So 2 similar items, Rabbi Yehuda thinks they don't nullify each other. But the way you deal with something when you have 3 items and 2 are the same, but the second one is mixed with something else. We saw this in laws of Yein Nesach, if you remember, in Avodah Zarah. Salek et mino kemisha eno. You look, so you have now oil coming out of the mincha, okay, the bigger one. You have oil coming out of there. And then on the other side, you have a kometz, which is made up of a lot of flour and some oil. So since you now have oil, but also flour, you view the oil in the kometz as if it's not there. So it's not a min b'mino at this point. And how does the nullification work? She'eno mino rava alavu mivatlo. The solet, which is actually more than the oil, it's a bigger amount than the oil that's coming out of the other one, so the solet overpowers the oil and absorbs it into it, and therefore we end up with this problem that now you're going to have, and why Rabbi Yehuda doesn't permit this kind of situation and allow it to be burned, because he says now this one has more oil because it absorbed, and that one has less oil because it got absorbed by the other, and that's why this works and doesn't actually contradict the min b'mino of Rabbi Yehuda. So within the second section, the first section we already reviewed, I'm just going to review the second. We had a machloket. Okay, there was one case they all agreed about, kometz and kometz, since they're both the same amount of solet and oil. We're going to say that's totally fine. Everyone says they can be burned on the altar. But if you mix a kometz with a mincha, since the oil is different, so the rabbis say we have no problem because ein olim mevatlim ze'etzeh. 2 things that go on the altar, there's no laws of bitul. Even if actually physically some oil gets into the other one, we view these as 2 separate items. They keep their original status and there's no problem. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, actually the oil goes from one to the other. Now this seemed to completely contradict Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that min b'mino eino vatel, because oil and oil, right? But then we explained, no, it's not the oil mevatel, the oil, and maybe that's why we had trouble understanding it, because that's not really what's going on here, right? At the bottom of Kaf Ben and Bet, we didn't really understand what this had to do with bitul. Once we explained it like Rava, it makes sense, because it's the large amount of flour that's absorbing the oil into it and basically nullifying it, and which basically means absorbing it into it, and therefore this one's going to have too much, and this one is going to have too little, and therefore it's going to be disqualified. And as I mentioned before, there are multiple interpretations of how to read this. I went with Rashi's interpretation, but there are others, so just so you should know, and if you're interested, you can read up the different interpretations. Each one, leaves always something a bit hard to figure out, and that's why there's many interpretations. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a Tu B'Shvat Sameach, and have a great day.